Hello, friends. Welcome to Type 56, the story of China's army. I'm Jason Clower. In November 1978, the man with the crappiest, most thankless job in the whole PLA called Beijing and told them, "Stop everything. We have huge problems." He had been down south looking at the preparations for China's invasion of Vietnam, and what he found was even more calamitous than expected. General Zhang Zhen was the head of the PLA's General Logistics Department, the GLD, which was the least fashionable and maybe the most challenged of the PLA's traditional trio of general departments. If the PLA were an aging rock band, the General Staff Department, the operators, there was a lead singer. The General Political Department was the band's manager, not as glamorous as the operations people, but tight with society's real power elite. And the humble, unappreciated General Logistics Department was, if you'll forgive me, bottom bitch. They chartered the buses and arranged the catering and managed the roadies, so to speak. They just generally arrived early and left late. So in the PLA's Division of Labor, the General Logistics Department wasn't even the drummer. That was maybe the guys from the Signal Corps who had to crawl out into the middle of a muddy field under shell fire and repair field telephone lines. No, the hapless loggies were the people like Zhang Zhen, who had to be the saddest man in the PLA at the end of 1978. See, he had been told early that China was going down south to chastise the ungrateful little brothers in Vietnam, or as Beijing liked to call them in its propaganda, the Xiaoba, the little tyrants. Little because they played second fiddle to their boss in Moscow, the big tyrant. Well, Zhang Zhen went down south to see how preparations were unfolding, and I'm sure he was not expecting great things, but he also couldn't have been expecting eye-poppingly bad things. What he found was that the cupboards were really, really bare. Part of the reason for that was that during Mao's lifetime, Mao simply could not shower enough gifts on the Vietnamese. So he just stripped the arms right out of the racks of the PLA's own companies and took rice out of its soldiers' rice bowls to send to the Vietnamese. This is going to blow your mind, but when General Zhang made his readiness inspection tour, he found that a third of the infantry, quote unquote, riflemen who were going to make this invasion did not have rifles, just grenades. That's a third of the fighting soldiers, not even the truck drivers or the cooks or the other non-combatants. Those guys, turned out, had a heck of a lot of combat ahead of them too, but they would just have one or two SKSs per squad. No, the riflemen themselves had only two-thirds of the guns that they needed. How did this happen? Well, as we said, China had actually been donating a large part of its own arms production for at least a quarter century to the Vietnamese People's Army that it was about to go fight. Right from 1950, China was sending Vietnam military aid that it just couldn't afford, and Mao was well and truly obsessed with the needs of the little brothers in Vietnam. One thing that I've never understood that I don't think anybody really gets is that somehow or other, Mao got this huge bug in his bonnet about sending the VPA ship's biscuit. What even is that? People around him did not know, much less understand what his fixation was on ship's biscuit. But sure enough, Mao was the communist emperor of the PRC. And so his underlings got a factory in Shanghai busy making hardtack to send to the Vietnamese, which I'm sure they appreciated very much. Um, but of even more concern to the military readiness people was that Mao had also been shipping them AKs right out of China's factories like they were pocket change for the Salvation Army. By my count, which is not especially masterful or terribly well informed, it was very common at Factory 626, home of the Chinese AK, to send maybe a third of its annual production down to Vietnam. From what I can tell, they were doing that from 1960 at the latest, well into the 1970s. And they were doing this, remember, even as they were struggling in the late 60s and early 70s just to re-equip their own soldiers with SKSs after the flop of the Type 63 rifle. See our earlier episodes about that one. Next, poor General Zhang of the logistics department found that Chinese ammo stockpiles were not what they should have been. When Zhang's people spot checked their ammunition supplies, they found a third of it defective. If that sounds amazing, just think of some of the stories that we've been dealing with in our recent episodes about the Sino-Vietnamese War, and think how many times there was a dud munition that almost changed the course of a battle for the worse. A third of their small arms and artillery rounds did not go bang. Next, such supplies as the PLA did have ready often were not in the right place. China was always expecting to fight the Soviets on their northern border. And not that they were ready for that, but at least they were expecting it. But they were really unready to fight a war all the way on the other end of their country. The PLA's loggies were especially not prepared to supply soldiers fighting in a foreign land. The PLA was set up explicitly for the continental defense of the Chinese homeland, not for operating outside its own borders, or, and this is pivotal, away from their own railroads. The PLA was not set up to go campaigning at any distance away from their own railheads. And now they had gone and attacked an army of well-trained, experienced hornets in their own nest. Oh, friends, I'm pretty sure somebody at the top table in Beijing did not consult the General Logistics Department before they gave that order. Because this is why General Zhang Zhen had to call up from down south and say, stop, stop, stop. If you can't cancel this invasion, we have to wait for a month because there is so much wrong. And friends, we haven't even started the list. There wasn't a system for moving the PLA's own supply of artillery shells from the railhead where they would come off the train out of Guangxi over the border into Vietnam to their own troops. In fact, they didn't have enough soldiers to send on a Vietnam invasion either, not trained soldiers. There's a saying in Chinese, you feed and quarter soldiers for 1,000 days only to use them once. 养兵千日，用兵一时. Point being, soldiers are an investment. They're a pretty long-term investment. Raise them, train them, feed them for 1,000 days, use them on one fateful day. Well, friends, if only the PLA had actually trained these soldiers for 1,000 days, because it turned out many of them had been trained for less than 3 weeks. See, that winter, when the PLA was preparing for war in Vietnam, they were filling up their infantry units to their fully authorized strength. In those two southern military districts of Yunnan and Guangdong, every outfit divided like a mean, nasty, red-colored little PLA cancer cell, metastatically into two separate outfits that then got bulked out up to their authorized fighting power in all of the divisions and regiments. Well, this sounds great in theory, and I'm sure it makes a very impressive diagram. But what it meant on the ground was that in the infantry companies, say, which are the home and hearth of the real PLA, was that each infantry commander lost something close to half of his long service soldiers, defined here just really modestly as like guys who had been around for more than a year. Those quote-unquote long service soldiers got promoted one level maybe and then sent somewhere to form the cadre, the backbone of some other squad or platoon. And the political officers on high who handled the PLA's mobilization and billeting functions, they then poured new recruits into those many metastatically multiplied companies. This was the old Soviet plan for crash mobilization of their armed forces. It's what's called the cadre conscript system. Everyone hated it. The men in a company were a band of brothers in the PLA. That was not just mawkish, poetic sentiment. It was true. Brothers. Nobody wanted to face the ultimate ordeal, torn away from his own brothers, lumped in with a bunch of strangers and FNGs who were so new that their liberation sneakers barely even stank of ringworm and trenchfoot yet. No, they wanted the brothers that they knew. But of course, who hated the system the most? It wasn't the privates. It wasn't even the junior leaders who got saddled with some reject squad of fuck ups and weak sisters. No, the people who hated it the most were the company officers, specifically the XOs and the assistant political officers, because they were the ones left holding the bag when their outstanding COs and chief political officers got raptured away up to battalion. And then they, the number twos, were left behind to preside over the bleeding off of half of the men. And then they got to go lead whatever was left into battle with a bunch of fresh recruits. It's almost like the better the officer, the bigger the price he had to pay as a competence tax. I guess it's like what Marx said, from each according to his ability, right? Well, more on that in a minute. First, how bad was the quality of the manpower that now flowed into these multiplied divisions? It was pretty bad in places. The poor General Logistics Department found that in one supposedly crack company in the Guangdong Military District, they had 60% raw recruits who were in the middle of their third week of basic training. Moreover, only 1/3 of the company had actually been trained in how to attack as a squad. 0% of the company had been trained in squad level defense. So Zhang Zhen, the Loggy general, he blew the whistle up to Beijing and made the political leaders at least postpone their invasion for a month so that he could finish the soldiers' basic training, so that every man had fired some live rounds out of his weapon, if they could get him a weapon, and thrown a live grenade, and so that in theory, the battalion had at least practiced operating as an actual battalion once in theory. But in practice, oh boy, no. Few soldiers knew how to shoot anything bigger than their SKS or AK. Only 1/3 of the infantrymen that they checked on were actually trained in the company's other weapons, including even something as commonplace as the Type 56 squad light machine gun, or an RPG, or a 60 millimeter mortar, or the company's heavy machine guns. Speaking of companies, though, the worst problem, the worst shortage that they faced was officers. If you watch this channel regularly, you already know that the PLA promoted its officers from the ranks. To overgeneralize only a little bit, every Chinese officer was a Mustang. And if you're a regular viewer, you'll also know that the PLA was not big on formal officer training programs. It was all OJT, on-the-job training. Sure, there were periods in the PLA's spastic efforts to modernize itself when the officially stated policy was to quote unquote require officer candidates to go through some kind of formal military schooling for a year, 2 years. But that was the official policy. And friends, in China, evading official policy is an art form as refined and sublime as anything ever painted by the greatest Dutch portraitists. It's as pliable a medium for expressing fine gradations of mood and emotion as the average Song Dynasty lyric poem. So even when it was official PLA policy to send officer candidates to some kind of officer training college, it was not being followed. And the rising second lieutenants were not being sent away to academic institutions and separated from their companies for a year or more, with the company commander just praying that his officer candidate wouldn't get talent spotted by somebody and then snatched away by a greedy staff colonel. No, no, no. And furthermore, if you're a fan of this channel, you know that there was once a thing called the Cultural Revolution. And for almost the 12 years preceding, there was no officer education system anyway. The Cultural Revolution practically began by letting the higher education system immolate itself. And that included the military schools also, not just the civilian ones. The Nanjing Military Institute, which was the PLA's West Point and Command and General Staff College, was abolished. Its library was destroyed, and its commandant, who was none other than General Zhang Jun himself, was kidnapped by radical student anarcho-communist activists twice. At one point, the deputy defense minister himself showed up to protect Zhang with a posse of armed men at the Jinxi Hotel where Zhang was in hiding. And the deputy defense minister and 6 gunmen took control of the 12th floor of the hotel and the stairways that provided access to it. And the deputy minister gave orders to his men to shoot anyone attempting to storm the 12th floor and kidnap General Zhang again. So you can tell that at the Nanjing Military Institute, they were not exactly following the standard curriculum for military professional education. And they were not producing young officers yet ready to take their place in modern combined arms warfare. In fact, partway through the Cultural Revolution, the whole institute was simply abolished. And maybe worst of all, its library was discarded and dispersed. That was a disaster, friends, that makes my head explode. This was the destruction of the Great Library of Alexandria in PLA terms. Why? Because there were no copies. Friends, this was the mid-20th century. In a destitute third world country, Mao's word, not mine, a destitute third world country where books and printing were expensive. The language was not alphabetical, and it was hard to typeset. And it's not like there were computers or word processors or photocopiers. And documents and records and files and reports and translations in those days were, like as not, written by hand. Much of what was in the library at the Institute was unique. People had translated it painfully from Russian, English, French, German, Japanese, even at a time when knowing some of those languages could actually get you in real political hot water. When these exotic foreign military manuals were unobtainium in China, that library represented whole careers of work by minds who were irreplaceable freak singularities within the Chinese military community. They had irreplaceable combat experience. They had irreplaceable military educations, maybe partly in Russia that, okay, these educations maybe were far from world class, I grant you, but they were way more advanced than anything else that existed in the now pitifully withered Chinese officer corps of 1978. Good heavens, what a waste of knowledge to just turn that library into trash and flotsam. Ugh, it sickens me. And friends, when I say the officer corps of the day was withered and depleted, do you know how many officers in the PLA in 1978 actually had a college degree? 8%. That's obscene. Now, don't misunderstand me, friends. Even though I am a professor, I am not one of these people who thinks that we should mindlessly point every student under heaven to college for a 4-year degree. No, trust me, I work in the sausage factory. And I have great respect for the old PLA practice of elevating officers from the ranks. It had some undeniable merits. And could an outstanding officer be made from a really high-speed, highly motivated soldier who had just a 9th grade education? Yes, it happened all the time. The PLA had great platoon leaders that way, maybe even great company commanders. But it's probably no coincidence that when the PLA got to Vietnam, it started finding that it had severe weaknesses in their leadership at about the battalion level. A battalion officer's job is different from a company officer's job because his battlefield is too big to see with his own eyes. As a battalion officer, his job is now mostly to administrate by abstractions, symbols. His tools of war are maps, lists, tables, schedules, and timelines, com plans and networks, sit reps, intel, ambiguities everywhere. It seems that once a company commander reached battalion, he passed from one world to another. And whatever his previous aptitude with men and materiel and movement and motivation, that did not exactly translate into this new level that he was at. Some observers then came to believe that the PLA had good, even superb leadership at that company level and below, where bodies of around 100 men were under an officer's command, but that at the battalion level and up, the leadership was hit or miss because it all depended on skills that the PLA did not prepare anyone for systematically. This was the price of having an officer corps that was 8% college educated. And think about it. Maybe book learning is overrated for some combat arms like infantry, sure, but not for others. Not for things like artillery, not for things like armor and signals. No, no, no. This was especially true because by the time the PLA invaded Vietnam in 1979, it was very self-consciously trying to run a combined arms war. So officers in an infantry regiment were no longer just infantry commanders. They were combined arms commanders. At the very least, they needed to work well together with their supporting artillery units, and that involves a heck of a lot of science and logistics. Those artillery units depended heavily on their communications, which are never easy in the mountains. They depended heavily on their maps, their intel, their logistical trains, and everybody who fed their men and their guns, those very, very hungry guns. Those artillery officers, too, were very hard pressed even to have the quite minimal levels of professional training that were prescribed in their manuals. I was reading a report from one artillery regiment that was attached to an infantry division. And they discovered in the run up to the war that not one of their battalion commanders had actually attended battalion live fire training. Whoops! One of those officers had only been in his job for a month when they prepped the invasion. So, as their regiment was preparing for war, doing all the other things just as basic as like teaching their truck drivers to maneuver the roads that led to their jumping off areas and back. They also had to backfill the training for these officers to get them up to speed as fast as possible. That is not the kind of training that anybody wants to be doing on the eve of a war with the baddest Asian land power east of the Volga. To give you an idea of how complex this artillery training was, just one of the jobs for the enlisted men in the artillery batteries was that of calculation soldiers, 计算兵. These guys did ballistic math by hand in combat. And their jobs included not just calculating first round firing solutions and corrections, but also they had to discover and correct errors on their maps, which were plentiful. We'll discuss that another time when we talk specifically about the challenges of artillery in this war. They also had to do corrections when their shot didn't fall on the part of the very, very three-dimensional Vietnamese landscape that their maps had led them to believe. And also, they had to figure out mathematically, like, what ammo from what lot numbers had a muzzle velocity that was out of spec somehow, and then do a bunch of math to correct for the firing solutions for ammo using that particular lot number. My brain bleeds just thinking about it. Furthermore, when they were training up for the invasion, They also found that they didn't have the right information about the weather conditions and how those would influence the flight of their shells. So, among all their other jobs, like getting guns for their men and training their officers to do their jobs, they also had to send crews out to the field and do their own experimental practice shoots under different meteorological conditions so they could come up with their own data about how combinations of variables like air temperature and humidity would affect their shooting in their area of operations. All the calamities that affected their logisticians, all these deficiencies that plagued what officers they could find before the war. And friends, I'm going to give you a little spoiler. They didn't get to keep these officers for long. No, I'm not talking about officers being sucked up and out into other newly formed units. No, no. I'm talking about attrition in combat, which was always bad for the PLA because of its very laudable lead from the front attitude. But more than that, the Vietnamese, of course, knew exactly the kind of trouble that the PLA had with their officer corps, and they were waiting. One account that I'll leave you with from a soldier reads like this. The enemy were using American sniper rifles with high power scopes that could hit anything, and they were searching for the officers first. Anybody dressed like an officer who was giving orders, they would pick him off right away. Our junior officers liked to wave their pistols around when they were leading squad and platoon attacks, which got them found out and killed by the enemy in short order. I heard that this training officer in one regiment heard shots, got out of his vehicle, and then, while he was directing his men to dismount from the vehicles, he pulled his pistol. With that, an enemy sniper got him right in the head, and he was the first death in his regiment. Not long before that, I heard a company political officer in their sister regiment was trying to direct fire from a heavy machine gun during a counter ambush. He was looking through his binoculars, which, friends, which is a dead giveaway of an officer, and he took a couple rounds that seriously wounded him in the chest and the shoulder blade. He had once warned me that in wartime, we would be looking to take out the enemy commanders. Well, I guess they were too. After that, a lot of officers purposely switched to carbines and did a lot less shouting and waving. Friends, I'm sure it was smart for the PLA to switch to carbines. But if you're smart enough to watch this channel, you know that carbines were not any kind of real solution. No, they were just one more part of the PLA's many, many problems. What the PLA needed, finally, was an actual assault rifle. The Chinese were working on that as hard as they could. They called it the second gen automatic rifle program, and things were not progressing quite fast enough. That's a story for another day. But if you like this sort of content, please like and subscribe. Please comment. For some reason I don't understand, people tell me that it helps the algorithm. You might even visit our Patreon page. But this course remains free to all the world's workers, soldiers, peasants, and junior enlisted thrust terrified into jobs of leadership that they're not even trained for. I'm Jason Clower, and I cannot wait to talk to you next time.